She's also an animal health officer, and also our district vet, Nikki, who recently started with us on the 4th of October. Now, my internet isn't great at home, so if I freeze or start sounding like a robot, just let me know and I can repeat whatever I just said. But thank you all for coming to tonight's virtual presentation. I hope it's very helpful and informative and can answer any questions that you might have. But at the very least, we can be a contact for you moving forward. As Alicia said, we'll have some question time at the end, so please save any questions until then, as I'm wary of time. We'll try to answer all of your questions, but if there's something we don't have the answers for, and there's a few people who've indicated they would like to know also, we can endeavour to find out for you. So during the presentation, I'm going to be talking about the importance of planning, preparation of your property and animals, livestock behaviour during a fire, assessing injured livestock, and then we'll touch on floods and biosecurity emergencies. And in light of what we've all been through in the last 20 or so months, we'll also touch on livestock health and welfare during the pandemic. So Victoria faces a variety of emergency threats throughout different times of the year, ranging from fire to floods and storms to biosecurity incursions. Agriculture Victoria is the lead agency for biosecurity emergencies, which includes emergency animal diseases like foot and mouth disease and avian influenza, and emergency plant pests such as capra beetle. But we're also a key support agency with other emergencies such as fire and flood. And our main role in these incidents is to provide relief and recovery services to primary producers and rural landholders. So I'm sure we're all aware that natural disasters can hit often very quickly. So there's no time to plan when the fire front or flood is heading towards your property. It is so important to plan ahead, have the plan in place and practice it ahead of any disasters taking place. Planning ahead also ensures all elements that need to be considered are, such as yourself, your family, and in particular children, your livestock, your pets, and your property. And that is well thought out at a time when you're calm and thinking rationally, as opposed to in an emergency situation where time is of the essence and decision making can often be adrenaline fueled rather than rational. So what are we planning for? Bushfire and grass fire planning is often at the top of producer and landholders' priorities when it comes to emergency planning, but there are a number of other emergencies where the effects can be just as devastating, and they all carry significant risks in many areas, including physical, emotional, financial, environmental, and social risks. The key message is that late decisions can be deadly. So all landholders, both commercial primary producers and those on small acreage, need to have a plan in place and practiced. A reminder that material items can be replaced, but lives can't. Human safety is paramount, followed closely by your pets and your livestock. So it's crucial that pets and livestock are included in your survival plan, because there have been too many instances where injury or fatalities have occurred when people have stayed without a proper plan in place or have left too late because they're trying to figure out what to do with their animals. And finally, good preparation of your property and equipment can also improve those chances of survival and improve animal welfare, as well as mitigate damage to the property and equipment itself. So what do we need to think about? You need to ask yourself, do you plan to relocate your livestock and pets or keep them on your property if you plan to stay? Do you plan on taking your pets and leaving your livestock, or do you plan on relocating them a few days prior to high fire danger days, or at the point where you make the decision to leave? These are all things that need to be considered and form part of your survival plan. You also need to think about what else needs to happen or be considered along with the pets and livestock themselves. So have you undertaken good preparation of your property and equipment prior to the natural disaster warnings? Do you have plenty of feed and water for your pets and livestock, or how do you plan on arranging it? Are your pets and livestock adequately identified, which is something we'll cover in a later slide? Are your vehicles and floats, if you have horses, are they in good working order? for example, plenty of fuel, the tow ball and that sort of thing? Are your pets or livestock insured? And if so, do you have documents relating to their insurance that you would need to produce if making a claim? So, property preparation. Flame height can be up to 4 times the height of the fuel it's burning. So the safest areas are closely grazed, ploughed or bare paddocks. It's best not to confine livestock in yards or stables. You're better off moving them to the most bare paddock and ensuring that all internal gates are open. We'll touch on that in a later slide. Also, what might be appropriate is yards or a large sand menage may be used if they've got sprinklers, but again, don't lock the livestock in there. Ensure there are no trees nearby or that the yards are concrete and steel railing, not made from wooden rails. Think about a water source and how long it might be before the initial emergency has passed. It's best to ensure that livestock either have access to a dam or at a minimum enough water for 3 days. If you're relying on troughs that rely on electricity to autofill, this needs to be considered if the property loses power for a period of time. And this might seem obvious, but they are going to require significantly more drinking water in the heat and potentially smoky conditions. And also think about boundary fencing. Is it fireproof, or do you have another option for containing them if you know you normally rely on electric fencing and there are temporary outages in the electricity? And this is one of the reasons that adequate identification is important too if they escape during an emergency event. So more on what you can do to prepare your property. One major one is just general clearing of excess debris. So have a look around your sheds, yards and hay stores, ensure they're all tidied up. Consider a fire break in your boundary paddocks. So you'll see in the picture down the bottom, there's an example of that. Try to make them sort of at least 10 metres wide. If you leave your livestock on your property, it's a good idea to leave a notice on your front gate with a phone number, like in the top picture. And as mentioned a couple of slides ago, leave internal gates open. Some factors to consider: if fire trucks possibly require access to your property, wide entrances, if possible, 4 metres wide and a 4 metre clearance overhead and space for them to turn around at the end of tracks. And bridges and tracks would also require a minimum 15-tonne load capacity to accommodate a fire truck, and also access to a water supply. So it's important for pets and livestock to be identified appropriately in preparation for natural disasters. This is not only to assist in locating your animals if they go missing, or fences are destroyed and they end up on neighbouring properties or several kilometres up the road or something, but also if they end up mingling with other livestock, if you choose to relocate them, say, to a friend or family member's place, and they've got similar looking livestock, or a holding area, for example, some communities I think might open up their showgrounds or something like that to accommodate livestock, and they're similar looking livestock there too, then you'll be able to identify your own. So cattle, sheep and goats require electronic tags, but you can also apply management tags with your details on them or another unique identifier to your property so you know that they're your livestock. Pets and horses will be microchipped, but for visual aid, you could also use ID tags on collars for pets, or tags in the mane or halter for horses, or written on their bodies with a grease crayon. So this is one of the main reasons that it's a legislated requirement for all properties with livestock to have a property identification code, which we refer to as a PIC, and also to ensure the details relating to that PIC are up to date, because we use the information on our PIC database to contact people in the affected area who have livestock, and we conduct impact assessments with them, the affected landholders, and can also assist with assessing injured animals if they require it. And you can update those details on the Agriculture Victoria website if you need to. It's crucial that your vehicles and floats are in good working order, basically, so they're roadworthy, they're registered, and just generally in good working order. It's a good idea to come up with a list of what you might need for at least 3 days. So think about your own personal needs and the needs of your children. So food, water, medications, any other first aid materials you might need, phones and chargers, a torch and batteries, etc. You also might want to consider maps and emergency phone numbers, considering that phone towers could have been damaged in the fire or flood. So don't rely on reception for Google or Google Maps. Also be aware that in certain conditions you could lose your bearings even if you're familiar with that area. Consider the needs of your livestock and pets. So food, water, a bowl or container for pets, medications, bedding, any relevant paperwork, collars and leads for dogs, a halter for horses, etc. It's also a good idea as part of your plan to have practice loading horses into floats and travelling with them prior to any kind of emergency event. Horses will likely already be stressed as it is, let alone if they've never been loaded onto or travelled in a float before. And also just know where you're going. Again, this seems obvious, but have that pre-arranged and part of your plan. And also consider the fact that those nearby are also likely to be affected and in the same boat. So it's probably not feasible for them to go to a friend's or family member's place just down the road. So a bit about livestock behaviour during a fire. As is generally the same with humans, the primal fight-flight response will likely kick in. And this is why it's important not to interfere, but just open internal gates and allow space and don't confine them. For horses, ensure you've taken off all their gear, such as halters, fly bells and rugs. Cattle are very much the same, just provide them plenty of space and don't confine them. Sheep and alpacas are usually very flighty and will mob together and run. Sheep might pile on top of one another or against a fence, and alpacas might sit and freeze as their response to imminent danger. Goats will likely run as well, but not necessarily always as a mob. For pets, it is best to confine them because they might attempt to run away if they're frightened. They can be susceptible to smoke inhalation and heat stress, so just ensure they have access to plenty of water and cool areas. Pigs are poorly insulated animals. They're very susceptible to heat stress and they require constant access to fresh water. They can run pretty fast, so they'll require a safe and secure area. So the decision to humanely destroy injured stock should be made purely on welfare grounds. It's important to consider both short-term welfare, so the severity and location of the burns, as well as how extensive they are, as well as their long-term welfare. So that includes the impact of the injuries on their productivity and the availability of feed and water if the property's been pretty burnt out. So the options for dealing with burnt livestock are humane destruction for those worst affected. So if they're, recumbent or immobile, in any kind of respiratory distress, severe charring of limbs, muscle or facial tissue, if their hooves are lost or beginning to detach from their feet, burns to over 15% of their body, severe burns to sensitive areas such as udders and teeth, genitals and facial areas like eyes, lips and nostrils, or if they generally just appear very distressed, that's also another indication they might need euthanizing. Salvage slaughter is not always available, so that's just something to consider, but there are sort of conditions that they would need to meet to be fit to load. So they wouldn't want to have any severe respiratory distress. They need to be weight-bearing and mobile, no lameness, and no bare skin that's burnt. That could cause infection in transit, basically. Your third option, is to treat and reassess. So this might be for stock who have severe burns to less than 10% of their body, superficial or moderate burns over a larger area, mild burns only to those sensitive areas, mild burns only to feet, so it can't be the burns can't be also coming up their lower leg and their hoof is still attached, and no severe respiratory distress. And those that have mild superficial burns only, no concurrent disease or high risk of disease due to the burns, and no respiratory dysfunction, those stock up right to return to the paddock, basically. So there's a lot of overlap when it comes to fire versus flood and storm preparedness. So I won't go into the same level of detail, but just consider the same sort of things. So are you in a flood-prone area? And what changes might you make to mitigate that risk? Plan your evacuation routes and pre-arrange where you plan to go. And ensure you have enough emergency supplies to be self-reliant for at least 3 days. So this is just a handy little checklist. I think it's available on the Agriculture Victoria website, but feel free to take a photo of the slide. The point of this slide was simply that it might be helpful for some people to make themselves a checklist as part of their plan. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but tailor it to be relevant to your situation in terms of your family, animals and property. It'll just be a quick reference and it saves you having to think of certain things during a highly stressful situation. So you could type up something like this, print and laminate, and that could be kept with your emergency supplies ready to go. So as with natural disasters, biosecurity incursions can have significant physical, emotional, financial, environmental and social impacts as well, and also potential reputational damage and stigma associated with them. Like biosecurity incursions can happen to anyone, but the key to prevention is implementing good biosecurity practices and have a clear understanding of potential pathways of introducing animal or plant diseases. Agriculture Victoria has both an emergency animal disease hotline and an emergency plant pest hotline. They're both 24/7 and there's no penalties for reporting something that turns out to be benign and not the suspected disease. So if in doubt, always report it early. Early detection is a critical step in minimising the impact of biosecurity emergencies. So both commercial primary producers and small landholders can play a role in both the prevention and risk mitigation of a biosecurity incursion by implementing good farm biosecurity, ensuring you have a PIC and that the details on your PIC are up to date, identifying your livestock according to the appropriate identification requirements for that species, and also ensuring that all your livestock are registered to your property on the NOS database. These measures both reduce the likelihood and potential consequences associated with biosecurity emergencies. So when it comes to potential pathways of introduction of pests or diseases, almost anything moved onto your property could be a potential source, including water, feed, fertiliser, vehicles, people, and clothing and equipment. So it's good practice to keep records of what has moved onto and off your property and on what dates. There's some good resources online, such as the Farm Biosecurity website. They have some very useful information around biosecurity and how to implement it properly. So lastly, I'm sure no one wants to talk about this, but it's certainly another complicating factor in the world we currently live in. You might have come out unscathed so far, but you could be faced with 14 days quarantine with little warning. So in the event that your animals are not kept on the same property as where you live, you need to consider their health and welfare in the event that you are required to self-isolate. Consider who is willing and able to look after them on your behalf. Ensure that they have adequate feed, water and supervision during that time, that they're provided any required treatments or supplements. if they need to be housed of an evening, who is going to do that? If a calf or lamb or foal or whatever needs pulling, in the case of horses, do they need rugs put on or taken off, etc.? There's a lot to think about, as you all know, so that must be considered, as your animals are still your responsibility. Also, if you are a commercial primary producer with staff, ensure you've got a COVID safe plan in place and think about how things will be dealt with if you or a staff member becomes COVID positive, both in terms of how the business will continue operationally, as well as COVID cleaning protocols and support for the affected staff member. So to summarise, AgVic is here to help. So please call us if you have any questions relating to livestock health, welfare or traceability. And just prepare and practice your plan. Ensure it works logistically for you, your family and your animals. These are the contact details of your local animal health staff. So feel free to take a photo of that slide as well. Nikki, myself and Rachel are obviously in here. David is another animal health officer who works with us. So please don't hesitate to call us if you require assistance or advice. And that is all I have for tonight, unless Nikki or Rachel have anything to add. But thank you for listening. And I think we're going to do question time right at the end after David has spoken. So
I might pull rank and ask a question, as
sure.
is my pleasure. But just again, I'm not a farmer, so I have very little knowledge on this. But just for the people watching or listening later, in terms of a pick, is there a size requirement for a property? Is it only for bigger properties, or if I own 1 or 2 horses, do I need to have that, or what's the requirements around that?
No, so it's not just large properties. It's any property with livestock. The only number requirement is with poultry. You have to have you need over 50 chickens to need a pick when it comes to poultry. But if you've got, say, 30 chickens and you've got 1 pet goat, you would still need a pick because you still have a goat, even though you've got less than. So it's and a lot of people also think that you only need a pick if you buy and sell, and that's not true, because it's actually it identifies to us where livestock are. So in the event of both a fire or a flood or a biosecurity, so in a disease outbreak, specifically it would identify where species susceptible to that disease are located, but also in a fire or a flood, it just shows us which properties have livestock at all in the affected area. So we would be able to contact them, do the impact assessment. What livestock do you have, and are they injured? Do you need help assessing them? That sort of thing. So it's any property with livestock, even just 1 horse or 1 goat or something. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And is that information used in an emergency? Say, for example, you have a fire or a storm. Do Agriculture Victoria then check on properties or provide that information to others to check on those properties as well?
Yeah. So usually we would in a large scale event, we would have an emergency response set up, and before COVID we would go out into the field in teams of 2 and we would knock on doors, and it's nice to speak to people in person, especially when they've just been through a disaster. But during COVID, during the flood, certainly on the Queen's birthday weekend there in June, that was done over the phone. And what we would do is we've got sort of a set of questions we go to about property damage, any injured livestock, do they need feed, and personal needs as well. And we just do a full impact assessment. And then if that person indicates to us on the phone, and I'm sure it'll go back to being in person, when COVID is over. But yeah, at the moment, if that person has sort of indicated on the phone, or if we get the impression on the phone that they might require assistance with a visit, then we would note that and we'd send a team out there.
No, excellent. I think it sounds like if I owned a horse, if I was lucky enough or owned some livestock, that it's in my best interest to have a pick. So I'll definitely remember that information and put that down in the memory bank for the next time we have an emergency in an area where there's livestock or horses, or if I've got 30 chickens and 1 goat, I'll remember to register that.
Get
No,
a
thank
pick.
you. I just
Yeah.
had to touch on that while it was still fresh in my
Yeah,
mind.
yeah.
Thank you.
And it's very easy. You just go on, if you just go onto the Agriculture Victoria website, and you can just search it or whatever, property identification code, and it's free. You just follow the prompts online, and then you get a card in the mail, I think, just saying this is your pick. It's very easy and free.
Excellent. Thank you. Sorry, Alicia.
No, that's right. Thank you very much, Monique. I'll just take a quick opportunity to say welcome to our Mayor, Councillor Owen. Welcome and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Alicia, and sorry I haven't got the camera on. I've got a pretty bad hairdo at the moment. So, yeah, thank you. I'm enjoying the presentations, and thanks, Monique. Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you, and thank you for that, Monique. Up next, we've got David Young, who, as I mentioned earlier, he's a member of the Victorian Farmers Federation, but tonight he's here representing himself from personal lived experience around stock management during a bushfire. So take it away, David.
Thank you, Alicia. As Alicia said, any views I express, any views or opinions I express are not my personal views and not necessarily the views of any organisation I've been associated with or are associated with at the moment. I'm realistic enough to realise that unfettered access to the fire ground after the fire, the impact of fire, is no longer a right, as a lot of farmers my age seem to consider it, because of the personal risk. If you've evacuated the fire ground, the gaining access immediately after the fire is no longer considered safe, and it usually takes 3 or 4 days to regain access. And what I'll be talking about tonight is around providing a safe area for your livestock and a water supply, principally so that they can remain within the area that they're familiar with. I've had experienced direct impact of fire, and on other occasions seen the effect of it within this area. I've lived in the area all my life, so obviously over that time I've experienced some fires directly and also the impact of fires within the immediate area. Fires can occur with little or no warning sometimes. Sometimes you can have warning over a day or two, but often the fires that I've experienced, a lot of them have impacted me with little or no warning. And when the animals and people when impacted by fire, can become stressed and agitated, and moving the animals under those conditions can often be a recipe for disaster. And often injuries occur to people when they're trying to move animals they're either unfamiliar with, or animals that are, because you're stressed, they become stressed, and that's when accidents occur. So personally, I've got quite a few head of cattle, and we did have a lot of horses some years ago. We had never considered moving the stock off the farm. It was always our intention to try to provide a safe refuge area on the farm, which the animals are familiar with. And that's important. So the safe refuge area we've always tried to provide was an area, it's centrally located within the farm, so it's easy to get animals. You might have a number of different paddocks of animals, so it's easy to get them to the refuge area. And the refuge area should be a heavily grazed area, so you graze it heavily at the start of summer, so it has very little pasture on it, or it could be a summer cropped area. So summer cropped areas are actually quite effective as a refuge area. They certainly proved that out in the Western District during some of those fires there on dairy farms. And if possible, you could cultivate an area 10 to 20 metres wide around the, lightly cultivate an area 10 to 20 metres wide around the outskirts of the area, around the edge of the area, particularly from the direction the approaching fire would generally come from. Where it is sited depends on the topography of the land and the probable direction and type, probable direction the fire will be coming from, and the type and number of livestock you've got. So as was mentioned earlier, with sheep, they tend to crowd into a corner on top of one another. My experience has mainly been with cattle and horses. They react quite differently to sheep to fire, especially horses. Within the refuge area, you should have a safe and secure water supply. And I think this is something that certainly was brought out by the Black Saturday fires. The people had livestock, but they didn't have any way of supplying them with water, and the stock tended to move with all the fences destroyed within the area. The secure water supply should have a large, fully enclosed, fire-resistant water tank, which is filled with water the stock are used to drinking. It should be connected by a fire-resistant pipe to a fire-resistant trough. It should be sited in the refuge area. That's my personal view, and as mentioned earlier, it should have at least 3 days water supply within the for the number of stock you've got in the tank. That's particularly important that the stock it's water they're used to drinking, because particularly with horses, if it's not water they're used to, some of them will not drink it. And and it should be replaced from time to time to keep it fresh. And hopefully, if they survive the fire with access to a good secure water supply, they will stay within the immediate area. They won't tend to move away from that area. So hopefully they'll stay in that area and not move away from the water supply. And by that time, you'll have, or someone will have access to the area, be able to provide them with food, with hay, and they'll stay in the area. I've also experienced on my farm flooding. The main sort of flooding I've experienced is riverine flooding, and that's I don't have because I'm located on what was the Kuirup swamp. We don't have flash flooding in this area. Flash flooding is quite destructive and has to be managed quite differently. But I have the paddocks laid out so as they're long paddocks, and the animals can move as the water rises. They can move to higher ground, and generally they'll move to higher ground. There are some paddocks on the back of the property that I do have refuge areas for the stock to get onto, but the flooding can stay up for 4 or 5 days on my farm in a major flood, and having to move the stock from those refuge areas sometimes quite difficult. You're walking through water, or I'm walking through water up to my chest at times, and having to swim younger stock out, which is not a good idea. these are my personal views, and you should always access expert advice when making your property more resilient to natural disaster. And everybody's property will have their own individual things, and the stock will individual layout, and the stock will be, you'll have to develop the plan for your particular stock. But it's important, as was mentioned by our AgVic person, Monique, that you should have a plan when and implement that. And if you provide the stock with a safe refuge area, often you can leave yourself and the stock. You'll find that the stock will accommodate, will adjust to the fire, and if it's a reasonable area, you'll be surprised how well they'll survive. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, David. That was really informative, really great to hear that lived experience perspective as well. And I just had one point to touch on before, and you may have already pointed it out, but when we were talking about that reliable water source, and I know AgVic mentioned it, or Monique spoke about it earlier, as did you, having that reliable water source, and let's say your power's out, so you can't have that electric pump. The tank that you were talking about before, is that a gravity fed?
That'd be a gravity fed
arrangement. Yeah.
Fed tank, and that's, you'd have the tank and the trough close by one another. And as Monique mentioned, you wouldn't have in your refuge area, you shouldn't have any trees or anything like that. So, but the tank should be a gravity fed tank. It's not, I haven't got that system myself. Mine's slightly different. I would change it now to a fully, if I was redoing it, to a fully enclosed gravity fed tank, because you find with modern firefighting techniques and aerial bombardment that water supplies can get contaminated by fire retardants, and the stock just won't even drink the water that they've been familiar with. I've got where on our site, we've got a dam within one of the areas that we would have as a refuge area, a 10 megalitre dam. That probably should have a tank now placed on the bank of that dam with a trough next to it.
Just in case of any contaminants.
Well, yeah, you don't want the fireys. And the tank should be identified as stock water, and make sure that it's not used for firefighting, because they do guarantee to replace the water, but not immediately. And it would probably be with town water, and if your stock are used to bore water or creek water, they may not necessarily drink town water.
And that's really great points before as well about the difference in animals and the difference in animal behaviours, and particularly, as you're saying, horses there have their particular waters. And Stuart, I was just wondering, so thank you very much, David. I was just wondering if you could just come on and touch on fire breaks.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, so one of the roles I hold at council is our municipal fire prevention officer. So we also do council's fire hazard inspection program. We do focus heavily on agricultural properties and grass fire risk. And as Monique touched upon, depending on the property size will depend on the size of the break that we ask. But the bigger the break, the better to stop grass fires. And if you as a producer do receive a fire hazard prevention notice from council, please do action that notice, or if you've got a question, please let us know. Often the main question we get, or the main concern we get from farmers is, I'm waiting for the appropriate time to harvest that field or do something, or it's going to be eaten out, in a month, or those kind of things. We can take that into account if we're informed. However, if we're not informed, and you don't get in contact with us, we will just proceed with the next stage, which will be after the date to comply passes, we will then get a contractor and then do those works on your behalf. So it's really important that we have that conversation with you, and you have that conversation with us. And whilst we are cognizant of those requirements, we're not across all the practices of all the different farmers. So it is important that you do get in contact with us. And if you have received a notice before, one thing I do recommend is get in touch. Often farmers will get in touch and say, hi, I'm from, 110 Bald Hill Road. This year, this is my plan. Please don't issue me a notice. And we can note that. And then we can check after the date that you said you're going to do that work. So it's definitely a conversation, and please do get in touch with us. I know it does sometimes cause a bit of angst with some of our agricultural residents in terms of those notices. But yes, please do get in touch. And same if you notice a neighbour or an absentee farmer who hasn't done a break, you've done the right thing on your property line, you notice someone else hasn't, please do let us know. We do want to know. It is a big shire, and often we can't actually see inside fence boundaries and those kind of things, but we're more than happy to come out and actually do a personal inspection and see the issue. But often they're sometimes really hard for us to see. So please do get in contact with us in regard to those fire risk or fire prevention issues. And one thing I might touch on, it's been touched on both by David and Monique, but in my spare time, I volunteer as a CFA volunteer, and I've actually have fought some fires on farming properties. And I just want to really reiterate the advice around gates. The bigger the gates, the better. Often the CFA tankers are very big, and in the smoke and in the dust, it just makes that little bit harder. So the wider the gates, the better. If you've got access gates, making sure they're in good condition is always really good as well in terms of opening the full width. Also making them really clear if you can, putting an indicator or a marker or something, a reflective marker that can sight that gate's really important. And also if there are any points in your track along in your paddocks that aren't trafficable. So I've had the experience where we've been in a CFA fire truck, we've tried to traffic along a paddock, and it's we've damaged the vehicle due to the terrain and the unserviceability of the track. So if you've got any tracks or things that aren't serviceable, please make it clear that they're not serviceable for the emergency services, because the last thing they need and you need is for them to get damaged or bogged on your property during an emergency. And as David touched on about marking water, so if you've got stock water, please do mark it. But if you do have a dam or a point where you do want it to be used for firefighting, you can get the firefighting water marker, which I'm sure a lot of farmers are aware of, which is the red triangle with the W on it. It's really clear. The firefighters will be looking for that when they're out and about in rural areas. And the CFA or DELT will leave if they do take water from your dam, they will leave a replacement card somewhere, usually in your letterbox. So please try and have a letterbox as well, but they will take note. They're required to take note of the property, when they took it, how much they took, and then they should replace it for you as well. But it's really important, if you've got a preferred place, mark it so they know that that's the preferred place to take your water. And again, I'm interested. I'm always like the old adage, you can take a horse to water, but they won't drink it. But I like how they're very they've got specific tastes. I didn't know that, David. They won't drink. They used to boil water. They won't drink town water.
No.
That's something new for me as well.
Yeah, no, that's the horses are notorious for that. Had that problem with horses on occasions myself.
Well, there you go. The saying rings true. There you go. I've learned a bit tonight.
Thank you for that, Stuart, as well. And Joe's just got a question there, which you did touch on before. Joe's asking, in the event of an emergency and supplies run out, are additional water supplies provided as a matter of priority for farms? So
I guess in terms of, so council obviously is responsible for relief and recovery in an emergency. Coordinating that, and we would work with partners. Farming is usually difficult, as David said, around access. Once we are given, or once it is made safe by the emergency services, then council can arrange support. So either feed, water, where applicable. But the key thing is that that will only occur once made safe. I'm guessing that's the same for Agricultural Victoria. I might throw to Monique or Nikki?
Thanks, Stuart. So that's emergency fodder and water for stock. That forms part of our impact assessments, as I touched on earlier. Our work is, unless injured stock need assessing and or euthanizing, most of our work is based on referrals that come out of that impact assessment. So we will capture that information, but then at the end of our assessment, we have a referral section where we will say, yep, this person is urgently in need of stock water, and they have hay, but they won't have any, by the end of the week, and we refer that. And in our emergency structure, we will have a referrals officer who just does that. That's just their responsibility. So they'll get all the referrals that we've, collected throughout the day from affected landholders, and they organise that. I don't know where that goes. Rachel might be able to contribute.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That might come to you, Stuart, at council, but yeah, we definitely flag that as an emergency, an urgent request and try and deliver that ASAP. But yeah, it would depend on access to the fire ground, so through the CFA.
Thanks for that, Rachel and Monique. Monique, we just got. Oh,
yeah,
sorry,
I think the best advice, just to round that out, is, as David has said and as Monique has said, you're not going to have access, and the Victoria Police is not going to allow access through the traffic management points until the fire brigade or SES deem the incident safe. So, no one else can get in to provide that support until it's deemed safe. So you need to have a plan in place for the first, 2 to 3, 4 days, depending on the emergency, to look after those animals, because no one else is going to be allowed in.
Thanks, Stuart. And Joe's got another really good question in there. In the event an animal needs to be euthanized and the owners are not on the property, who will be responsible to make the call to put the animals down?
Yeah, so in that event, if it's a property that we are on, and we have vets in our team as well, it's based purely on humane grounds for us. So if we think how badly and how long is that animal going to continue to suffer, if we left it, that's basically how we would make that call. We try to contact the owner first, but they might not always answer, or in the event of a fire or flood, phone reception might be an issue. So yeah, it does come down to humane grounds and just how severely that animal will continue to suffer if left. And as I said, there's sort of 4 different options that people have with injured stock, and it's only really those ones that fall into the immediate destruction category that we would have to consider that as an option if the owners weren't there.
Thanks for that, Monique. Were there any other questions? Did any of our other attendees tonight have any questions for Monique or David or Nikki? Reese.
It's not a question, but I just wanted to say thank you for David and Monique. It's been really informative. It was great to learn about the PIC system. And again, it was really good to hear from David's experience around the refuges. Again, I'm also a CFA volunteer, and I interact in these situations with farms. And we also get asked questions from residents before fires as well. So it's been really informative. and that's some great tips that I can share as well now. So really appreciate it.
Thanks for that, Reece. Did anybody else have any questions or comments they'd like to make before we wrap up? So I think what we will do, it'll be in the next couple of weeks. We'll take tonight's session and we'll be able to post it on the website along with those links that AgVic kindly supplied us with before, and that'll be there for everybody to watch and come in and get access to, even though those checklists about emergency preparedness on your farm. So there's just a couple of things happening in the chat just before we. And absolutely, yes. Thank you very much, Monique, Nikki, Rachel from AgVic for joining us tonight. Thank you very much, David, also for your presentation. Very informative, really interesting. I certainly learnt a lot. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.